The morning sun cast long shadows across Westminster Abbey as Prince William stood before the ancient mirror in his private chambers. Today was supposed to be the most glorious day of his life, his coronation as King of England. The weight of centuries pressed down on his shoulders, but it wasn't the crown that made him feel heavy. It was the secret he had been carrying for months, a truth that would change everything the moment he spoke it aloud. His wife, Catherine, entered the room. Quietly, her face pale despite the careful makeup applied by the royal stylists. She had been crying again. He could tell from the slight redness around her eyes that no amount of concealer could completely hide. They had talked about this moment countless times in whispered conversations behind closed doors, weighing the consequences of what they were about to do. "Are you certain about this?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She moved to stand beside him, and together they looked out at the gathering crowds through the tall windows. Thousands of people had traveled from across the Commonwealth and beyond to witness this historic moment. Television crews from every major network in the world had set up their equipment. The entire planet seemed to be watching. William took her hand in his, feeling the tremor in her fingers. "We've discussed this 100 times, darling. There's no other way. The people deserve to know the truth, especially today when they're placing their trust in me as their king." The secret they carried was not political scandal or financial impropriety. It was something far more personal and devastating. 3 months earlier, during a routine medical examination required before the coronation, doctors had discovered something unexpected in William's blood work. Further tests confirmed their worst fears. He was in the early stages of a rare genetic condition, the same one that had slowly taken his grandfather, Prince Philip, in his final years. The condition was hereditary, passed down through the male line of the royal family. It had remained hidden for generations, covered up by palace, physicians, and royal protocol. But William had made a decision that would break centuries of tradition. He would not hide his diagnosis from the British people. He would not pretend to be the perfect, invincible monarch they expected him to be. His private secretary, James Morrison, knocked softly on the door before entering. James had been with the royal family for 15 years and had never seen the prince look so determined yet so vulnerable. "Your Royal Highness, the Archbishop is ready to begin the procession. The guests have all taken their seats." William nodded, straightening his shoulders. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, not just rehearsing the ancient words of the coronation ceremony, but crafting the speech he would give afterward. It would be unlike any royal address in history, no flowery language about duty and service, just raw, honest truth about what lay ahead for him and for Britain. Catherine squeezed his hand one final time before stepping back to allow the ceremonial robes to be placed on his shoulders. The velvet was heavy and rich, embroidered with golden threads that caught the light. For a moment, William felt the full weight of history settling around him. His father Charles had waited his entire life for this crown, only to abdicate unexpectedly 6 months earlier, citing personal reasons that the palace had never fully explained to the public. The truth was that Charles had learned of William's diagnosis before anyone else. In a private conversation that lasted deep into the night, father and son had made the difficult decision together. Charles would step aside immediately, allowing William to be crowned while he was still healthy enough to serve. It was a gift of time, precious and limited. As the procession began, William walked slowly through the Abbey's ancient corridors, past portraits of kings and queens who had ruled before him. Some had reigned for decades, others for mere months. He wondered how history would remember him when his own brief time was over. Would they say he was brave for telling the truth, or foolish for destroying the carefully maintained illusion of royal invincibility? The great doors of the Abbey opened before him, and the sound hit him like a physical force. Hundreds of voices rose in unison, singing hymns that had echoed through these same stones for 1,000 years. The congregation stood as one. Prime ministers and presidents, celebrities and common citizens who had won the lottery for public seats, all of them expecting to witness a traditional ceremony of pomp and celebration. William's eyes found his. Children in the front row. Prince George, now 14, sat straight and serious, understanding more than most teenagers his age about duty and responsibility. Princess Charlotte, 12, waved shyly when she caught her father's eye. Little Prince Louis, only 9, fidgeted in his formal clothes but managed a gap-toothed smile that made William's heart clench with love and sorrow. How do you tell your children that their father won't be there to see them grow up? How do you explain that the crown they're inheriting comes with more than just privilege and responsibility? It comes with a genetic curse that may claim them too? The Archbishop of Canterbury stood waiting at the altar, the ancient crown of St. Edward glittering under the abbey's lights. Television cameras captured every angle, broadcasting the ceremony to an estimated 2 billion viewers worldwide. In homes and pubs and public squares across Britain and the Commonwealth, people had gathered to watch their new king be crowned. They had no idea that in less than 2 hours, many of them would be in tears. As William approached the altar, he caught sight of his stepmother Camilla in the second row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She had been the first person outside the immediate family to learn the truth, and she had wept openly when William told her of his decision to go public. "You don't have to carry this burden alone," she had said. "Let us help you." But this was something William needed to do himself. For too long, the royal family had hidden behind walls of secrecy and tradition. It was time for a new kind of monarchy, one built on honesty and human connection rather than distant perfection. Even if that honesty would break the hearts of millions who looked to the crown for stability and strength in an uncertain world. The ancient words of the coronation ceremony filled Westminster Abbey as Archbishop Justin Welby raised the crown of St. Edward above William's head. The golden circle, encrusted with precious stones collected from across the former British Empire, seemed to shimmer with the weight of history itself. In this moment, William was no longer just a prince. He was about to become the 40th monarch to be crowned in this sacred space. "Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the people of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and of your other realms and territories according to their respective laws and customs?" The Archbishop's voice resonated through the abbey. "I solemnly promise so to do," William replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. He meant every word, even knowing that his reign might be measured in years rather than decades. Catherine watched from her seat, wearing the diamond tiara that had belonged to Queen Elizabeth II. Her children sat beside her, George trying to maintain the composure expected of a future king, while Charlotte and Louis watched their father with wonder and pride. They still didn't know about the diagnosis. William and Catherine had agreed to tell them after the coronation, when the initial shock of the public announcement had begun to settle. As the crown touched William's head, a collective intake of breath could be heard throughout the abbey. Cameras flashed despite the strict protocols against photography during the most sacred moments. This was history being made, though none of the spectators yet understood how profound this moment would prove to be. The congregation included world leaders who had flown in from every continent. President Harris from the United States sat beside. Chancellor Müller of Germany. King Abdullah of Jordan conversed quietly with President Mbeki of South Africa. They had all come to witness what they believed would be a routine transfer of power, the continuation of a 1,000-year-old tradition. Among the guests, however, were people who knew the truth. Dr. Sarah Matthews, the royal physician who had first delivered the devastating diagnosis, sat in the section reserved for palace staff. Her eyes were red with unshed tears as she watched William accept the weight of the crown. She had begged him to reconsider his decision to go public, arguing that medical privacy was a fundamental right even for monarchs. "The people don't need to know everything," she had pleaded during one of their private consultations. "We can manage this condition quietly. Many patients live full lives with proper treatment." But William had been adamant. "I won't begin my reign with a lie," he had told her. "If I'm asking people to trust me with their country, they deserve to know who I really am, all of me, including my limitations." The ceremony continued with the presentation of the royal regalia. The archbishop handed William the golden orb, symbolizing the Christian world, then the scepter, representing his temporal power. Each item had been used in coronations for centuries, touched by the hands of monarchs whose names filled history books. Elizabeth I had held these same symbols. So had Victoria, whose reign had defined an entire era. William's mind wandered briefly to his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had worn this crown for 70 years before her death. She had been the picture of stability and duty, never once wavering in her public role. What would she think of his decision to reveal such personal information? Would she understand his desire for transparency, or would she see it as a betrayal of everything the monarchy stood for? The choir's voices soared as they sang Zadok the Priest, the same anthem that had been performed at every coronation since 1727. The familiar words filled the abbey. Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king. And all the people rejoiced and said, "God save the king! Long live the king! May the king live forever! Forever!" The word echoed in William's mind as he prepared to take his vows. His doctors had been careful not to give him a specific timeline, but the medical literature was clear about the progression of his condition. 5 years, perhaps 10 if he was fortunate, and the treatments proved effective. Certainly not the decades that previous monarchs had enjoyed. As the ceremony reached its climax, William found himself thinking about legacy. What could he accomplish in the limited time he had? What changes could he make that would outlast his own brief reign? His decision to reveal his diagnosis was just the beginning. He had plans for a new kind of monarchy, one that connected with people's real struggles and challenges. The final prayers were offered, blessing the new king and asking for divine guidance in his rule. William bowed his head, feeling the weight of the crown and the weight of his secret knowledge. In less than an hour, he would address the nation and the world. He would tell them about his condition, about the genetic curse that ran through the royal bloodline, about his determination to serve them faithfully for whatever time he had left. His speech was carefully crafted, but came from the heart. He had written it himself, refusing help from speechwriters who might have softened the impact of his words. There would be no euphemisms or medical jargon to hide behind. He would speak plainly about what lay ahead, both for him and for the monarchy itself. The service concluded with the national anthem, 2 billion voices around the world joining in song even as they remained unaware of what was coming. William stood as his subjects and citizens sang to him, asking God to save their new king. The irony was not lost on him. They were asking for salvation for a man who might not live to see his children reach adulthood. As the procession began to leave the abbey, William caught sight of his brother Harry in the crowd. Harry had flown back from California specifically for the coronation, putting aside years of family tensions to support his brother in this moment. Their eyes met across the crowded abbey, and Harry gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. He was one of the few people who knew what William planned to do next. The Golden State coach waited outside Westminster Abbey, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The same carriage had carried monarchs through the streets of London for over 2 centuries. Today it would carry a king who was about to break every rule of royal communication, who was about to trade the protective distance of monarchy for the vulnerable intimacy of shared human frailty. William stepped into the coach beside Catherine, their children following in the carriage behind them. The crowd lining the streets was massive. People had camped overnight to secure good viewing spots along the procession route. They waved flags and cheered, celebrating what they believed was the beginning of a long and prosperous reign. If only they knew that they were also witnessing the beginning of the end. The Golden State Coach rolled through the streets of London as thousands of people lined the route, waving Union Jack flags and cheering with genuine joy. Children sat perched on their parents' shoulders, clutching miniature crowns and toy scepters. Street parties had been organized in neighborhoods across the city, with tables groaning under the weight of traditional British fare. Cucumber sandwiches, Victoria sponge cakes, and endless pots of tea. William waved from the ornate carriage window, his newly crowned head catching the afternoon sunlight. Beside him, Catherine smiled and waved to the crowds, though those who knew her well could see the tension around her eyes. Every few seconds, her gaze would flick to her husband's face, searching for signs of the strain she knew he was feeling. The procession moved slowly down the Mall, past St. James's Park where more crowds had gathered. Elderly women in their best, hats dabbed at tears of joy, remembering the last coronation they had witnessed as children in 1953. Veterans in their dress uniforms stood at attention as the royal carriage passed, honoring their new commander-in-chief. Young couples held up smartphones to capture the historic moment, already posting photos to social media with captions like, "Our new king," and "God save King William." None of them knew that in less than an hour, many of these same people would be crying tears of sorrow instead of joy. Inside Buckingham Palace, the staff was making final preparations for the traditional balcony appearance. The red carpet had been rolled out across the famous balcony where generations of royals had appeared before the British people. Camera crews had positioned themselves in the courtyard below, ready to broadcast the moment when the new king would show himself to the nation. But today would be different. Instead of the usual brief wave and retreat back into the palace, William had requested that a microphone be set up on the balcony. The palace press secretary had questioned this unusual arrangement, but William had been insistent. "I need to speak to the people directly," he had said, "not through statements or official releases. They need to hear it from me, in my own words." The royal chef, Mrs. Henderson, stood in the palace kitchen, putting the finishing touches on the coronation feast. She had served the royal family for 20 years, preparing meals for state dinners, private family gatherings, and countless official events. Today's menu featured traditional British dishes alongside cuisine from across the Commonwealth, and a celebration of the unity that the monarchy represented. She had noticed something different about Prince William in recent months. He had become more thoughtful, more present during family meals. He would ask her about her grandchildren, remember details about her life that previous royals might have overlooked. It was as if he was trying to connect with everyone around him on a deeper level to really see the people who served the crown. Mrs. Henderson had no idea that William's newfound attentiveness came from his knowledge that time was precious, that every interaction might be one of his last chances to truly know the people in his world. The procession continued through central London, past landmarks that had stood for centuries. Big Ben chimed the hour as the golden coach passed the Houses of Parliament, where members of both parties had gathered on the steps to witness the return of their new sovereign. Prime Minister Johnson stood at the front of the group, his face beaming with the pride of a man who would go down in history as the first prime minister to serve under King William V. He, too, was unaware that his first audience with the new king, scheduled for tomorrow morning, would be unlike any meeting between monarch and prime minister in British history. William planned to brief him privately on the medical situation before making his public announcement, giving the government time to prepare for the constitutional questions that would inevitably arise. Could a king with a terminal diagnosis effectively serve his people? What provisions existed for a monarch who might become incapacitated? These were questions that had never been seriously considered in modern times, constitutional puzzles that would require careful navigation in the coming months. As the procession approached Buckingham Palace, the crowds grew even thicker. The famous Victoria Memorial was surrounded by people who had claimed every available inch of space. Police officers on horseback worked to maintain order as the excitement reached fever pitch. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the return of the new king to his official residence. The palace gates swung open as the golden coach passed through, and the crowd pressed forward against the barriers for a better view. The Yasi, famous red-coated guards, stood at attention, their tall black hats perfectly aligned despite the chaos around them. They, too, were unaware that their new commander-in-chief carried a secret that would soon transform their understanding of duty and service. William stepped down from the coach in the palace courtyard, still wearing the heavy coronation robes despite the warm afternoon. Palace staff rushed forward to assist him, but he waved them away politely. He wanted to walk under his own power to show strength even as he prepared to reveal his weakness. Catherine followed him into the palace, gathering their children around them in the grand entrance hall. The ancient walls were lined with portraits of previous monarchs, stern-faced kings and elegant queens who had ruled during times of war and peace, expansion and decline. Soon, William's portrait would join theirs, though it would tell a very different story than those who had come before. "Are you ready for this, Papa?" Princess Charlotte asked, tugging on his ornate sleeve. At 12, she was old enough to sense that something important was happening, though she couldn't quite identify what it was. William knelt down to her level, his crown catching the light from the crystal chandeliers above. "I'm ready, darling. But I need to tell you and your brother something very important after I speak to the people outside. Something that will change how we think about our family and our future." Prince George, now 14 and increasingly aware of his own destiny as future king, studied his father's face with growing concern. "Is everything all right, Dad?" "Everything is as it should be," William replied carefully. It wasn't a lie exactly. His diagnosis was part of who he was now, part of the truth he owed to his family and his nation. "But there are things about being king that are harder than people realize, things that I need to share with everyone." Young Prince Louis, still only 9 and more interested in the elaborate decorations around him than in adult conversations about duty and responsibility, tugged on his father's other sleeve. "Can we go see the people now? They're all waiting." "For us!" William smiled at his youngest son's enthusiasm, remembering his own childhood excitement at royal celebrations. "Yes, Louis, let's go see the people. They deserve to know their new king, all of him." The family made their way through the palace corridors toward the famous balcony. With each step, William felt the weight of what he was about to do. In a few moments, he would step out before the crowds and the cameras. He would smile and wave as expected. Then he would do something unprecedented in the long history of the British monarchy. He would tell the truth, the whole truth, regardless of the consequences. The doors to the famous Buckingham Palace balcony opened, and the roar from the crowd below was deafening. Thousands of people had gathered in the courtyard and stretched back along the mall, their faces turned upward in anticipation. Television, cameras from every major network in the world, were positioned to capture this traditional moment when the new monarch would appear before his people. William stepped onto the balcony first, still wearing the heavy ceremonial robes and the gleaming crown. The noise from the crowd intensified as they caught sight of their new king. He raised his hand in the familiar royal wave, and the response was electric. Union Jack flags fluttered in the afternoon breeze like a sea of red, white, and blue. Catherine appeared beside him, radiant in her ceremonial dress and tiara, followed by their 3 children. Prince George stood tall and serious, understanding the gravity of the moment. Princess Charlotte waved enthusiastically at the crowd, while young Prince Louis pressed his face against the balcony railing, amazed by the sheer number of people. Below, The crowd began chanting, "God save the king! God save the king!" The traditional words echoed off the palace walls, a sound that had been heard at this same spot for centuries. William felt the weight of all that history, all those expectations pressing down on him like a physical force. For several minutes, the royal family simply stood and waved, allowing the photographers to capture the images that would appear on front pages around the world. This was the moment that tradition demanded. The new monarch showing himself to his people, accepting their loyalty and affection in the time-honored way. But then William did something that had never been done before. He stepped forward to the microphone that had been specially installed for this occasion. The crowd gradually quieted, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. This wasn't part of the normal protocol. Royal appearances from this balcony were usually silent affairs, heavy with symbolism but light on words. "My people," William began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard through the amplification system. "My fellow citizens of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, today you have given me the greatest honor that can be bestowed upon any person. You have made me your king." The crowd cheered again, but William raised his hand for silence. His expression had grown serious, and those closest to the palace could see something in his eyes that gave them pause. "I stand before you today, not just as your new monarch, but as a man who believes that the relationship between crown and people must be built on truth, not just tradition. You have placed your trust in me, and I owe you nothing less than complete honesty about who I am and what lies ahead for our monarchy." Catherine moved closer to him, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of support that was captured by dozens of cameras. She knew this was the moment they had discussed and planned for. But hearing him begin to speak, the words still filled her with a mixture of pride and terror. "3 months ago," William continued, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, "I received news that changed everything I thought I knew about my future and the future of our royal family. During medical examinations required before the coronation, doctors discovered that I carry a genetic condition, the same condition that affected my late grandfather, Prince Philip, in his final years." A murmur ran through the crowd. People looked at each other with confusion and growing concern. This was not what they had expected to hear on such a joyful day. William pressed on, knowing that there was no turning back now. "This condition is hereditary, passed down through the male line of our family. It has been hidden by royal protocol for generations, but I believe that secrecy serves no one, not me, not my family, and certainly not the people who deserve to know the truth about their king." The silence in the courtyard was now complete. Even the children in the crowd had stopped their chatter, sensing the adult gravity of what they were witnessing. Television commentators around the world scrambled to understand what they were hearing, this unprecedented royal confession. "I want to be clear about what this means," William said, his voice growing stronger as he continued. "My doctors tell me that I may have years of good health ahead of me, or the decline may come more quickly. We simply don't know. What I do know is that I intend to serve you with every ounce of strength I possess, for as long as I am able to do so." In homes across Britain and around the world, people sat in stunned silence before their television sets. This was supposed to be a celebration, a moment of national pride and continuity. Instead, they were watching their new king tell them that he might not live to see his children grow up. "I know this news comes as a shock," William acknowledged, seeing the tears beginning to form in the eyes of people in the front rows below him. "I know it changes how you think about the future of our monarchy. But I ask you to consider this. Would you rather have a king who lies to you from the very beginning of his reign, or one who trusts you with the truth, no matter how difficult that truth might be?" An elderly woman in the crowd below began to sob openly. She had traveled from Scotland for the coronation, camping out overnight to secure a good viewing spot. She had expected to cheer for her new king, not to learn that she might outlive him despite being 30 years his senior. "My condition does not change my commitment to you," William said, his voice carrying across the stunned crowd. "If anything, it deepens it. I know that my time as your king may be limited, so I intend to make every day count. I will work to modernize our institutions, to bring the monarchy closer to the people it serves, to break down the walls of secrecy that have separated crown from citizen for too long." Prince George, standing behind his father, was beginning to understand what he was hearing. The color drained from the teenager's face as the implications became clear. If his father's reign would be brief, then his own future as king would come sooner than anyone had imagined. Catherine stepped forward to the microphone. She hadn't planned to speak, but seeing the shock and pain on the faces below, she felt compelled to add her voice to her husband's. "As your future queen," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "I want you to know that we will face whatever comes together, as a family and as a nation. William's courage in sharing this with you today shows the kind of king he will be, honest, brave, and deeply committed to serving you with integrity." The crowd was beginning to react more visibly now. Some people were crying openly, while others stood in stunned silence. A few began to clap, slowly at first, then with growing intensity. They were applauding not the traditional pomp of monarchy, but the raw courage of a man who had chosen truth over comfortable deception. "I ask for your prayers," William concluded, "not for a miracle cure, but for the wisdom to be the king you deserve for whatever time I have. I ask for your patience as we navigate uncharted waters together. And I promise you this: every decision I make, every action I take as your king, will be guided by love for this nation and its people." As he stepped back from the microphone, the reality of what had just happened began to settle over the crowd. Their new king had just told them he was dying. The coronation day that was supposed to launch a new era had instead become the beginning of what might be a very short reign, but something else was happening too. Something unprecedented in the long relationship between British royalty and their subjects. The distance between crown and people was dissolving before their eyes, replaced by something more human, more real, more honest than anything they had ever experienced from their monarchy. The silence that followed William's announcement lasted only moments, but it felt like an eternity. Then slowly the sound began to build, not the joyful cheers that had greeted the royal family's appearance, but something deeper and more complex. It started with scattered applause from individuals in the crowd who understood the courage it had taken for their new king to share such devastating personal news. The applause spread through the courtyard like a wave, joined by voices calling out words of support and love. "We're with you!" shouted one man near the front. "God bless you, Your Majesty!" cried an elderly woman, tears streaming down her face. The traditional formality of royal events dissolved in this moment of raw human connection. Television cameras captured every reaction. In the BBC studios, veteran royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell struggled to find words for what he had just witnessed. "In 40 years of covering the royal family," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have never seen anything like this. King William has just rewritten the rules of monarchy before our very eyes." Around the world, similar scenes were playing out in newsrooms and living rooms. In Australia, families gathered for coronation viewing parties sat in stunned silence, as the implications sank in. In Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau was hastily called away from his own coronation celebration to prepare a statement. In New Zealand, the Governor-General received an urgent call from Wellington asking how this news would affect the constitutional arrangements. Back on the palace balcony, William's children were beginning to process what their father had just revealed to the world. Prince George, at 14, was old enough to understand the full weight of what he had heard. He moved closer to his father, his young face showing a mixture of admiration and fear. This was not how he had imagined learning that his own path to the throne might come sooner than anyone had planned. Princess Charlotte, 12 and perceptive beyond her years, reached for her mother's hand. She had sensed for weeks that something was troubling her parents, had noticed the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Now she understood why her father had been spending more time with them lately, why bedtime stories had become longer and more frequent. Young Prince Louis, still only 9, was confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. The crowd below had gone from celebration to something that felt like mourning, though he couldn't understand why. He tugged on his father's ceremonial robes, seeking reassurance in the way that children do when the adult world becomes incomprehensible. William knelt down to his youngest son's level, the heavy crown tilting slightly on his head. "It's all right, Louis," he whispered, though his voice was picked up by the sensitive microphones and broadcast to the world. "Papa is going to be fine. We're all going to be fine." But even as he spoke these words of comfort to his son, William knew that "fine" had taken on a new meaning for his family. They would face challenges that no royal family in modern history had confronted. How to maintain the dignity and stability of the monarchy while acknowledging its fundamental humanity. In the crowd below, the initial shock was giving way to a complex mix of emotions. Many people were crying, not just the elderly who remembered other royal tragedies, but young families who had brought their children to witness what they thought would be a purely celebratory moment. Parents found themselves trying to explain to confused children why everyone was suddenly so sad on what was supposed to be a happy day. But there was something else emerging from the crowd as well, a sense of connection to the royal family that was unprecedented in modern times. For centuries, the monarchy had maintained its mystique through distance and formal protocol. Kings and queens were figures to be admired from afar, symbols of continuity and stability rather than real people, with real problems. William's announcement had shattered that distance. He was no longer just a king. He was a husband worried about leaving his wife too soon, a father concerned about his children's future, a man facing his own mortality with courage and grace. The crowd was responding to that humanity in ways that surprised even seasoned royal watchers. Social media platforms were already exploding with reactions from around the globe. The hashtag Brave King William began trending within minutes as people shared their thoughts and feelings about what they had just witnessed. Mental health advocates praised the king for his openness about medical challenges. Constitutional scholars debated the implications for the monarchy's future. But most ordinary people simply expressed their love and support for a man who had chosen honesty over comfortable deception. Inside the palace, senior staff members were scrambling to respond to the crisis. Private Secretary James Morrison was fielding calls from government officials, Commonwealth representatives, and international media outlets, all demanding more information. The palace press office, which had prepared dozens of standard statements about the coronation's success, was now drafting entirely different communications about the king's health and his plans for the future. Dr. Sarah Matthews, the royal physician, who had first delivered William's diagnosis, watched the television coverage from her office with a mixture of admiration and professional concern. She had advised against this level of public disclosure, worried about the stress it might place on her patient. But seeing the outpouring of support from the crowd, she began to understand William's wisdom in choosing transparency over secrecy. The medical community would have questions, lots of them. The specific nature of William's condition, his treatment, options, his prognosis, and the implications for other members of the royal family would all become subjects of intense scrutiny. But William had anticipated this and was prepared to share as much information as was medically appropriate and personally comfortable. As the royal family finally retreated from the balcony, the crowd below showed no signs of dispersing. If anything, More people seemed to be arriving as word of the king's announcement spread through social media and text messages. The mood was somber but determined, as if the British people were making a collective decision to stand by their monarch during his time of trial. The traditional coronation celebrations that had been planned for the rest of the day, street parties, ceremonial dinners, and festive gatherings took on a different tone. In pubs and community centers across the nation, people gathered not just to celebrate their new king, but to process what his announcement meant for all of them. Queen Camilla, who had been watching from inside the palace, emerged onto a smaller balcony to wave to the crowd. Her face showed the strain of the day's emotions, but also a quiet pride in her stepson's courage. She understood better than most what this decision had cost William personally, and what it might mean for the future of the institution she had served for so many years. As evening approached and the crowds finally began to thin, one thing was becoming clear. This coronation day would be remembered not for its pageantry or tradition, but for the moment when the British monarchy chose radical honesty over comfortable lies. The evening news broadcasts around the world led with the same story, the new king's shocking health revelation. But the tone was not one of scandal or embarrassment. Instead, commentators struggled to find adequate words for what they had witnessed. This was not a political crisis or a constitutional emergency. It was something entirely new in the relationship between royalty and their people. In the hours that followed, messages of support began pouring in from world leaders. President Harris called it an act of extraordinary courage that redefines leadership for the modern age. The Pope issued a statement praising William's brave witness to the truth that unites all humanity in our shared vulnerability. Even Republican politicians who had previously criticized the monarchy found themselves moved by the king's honesty. But perhaps most significantly, the British people themselves seemed to be responding with unprecedented warmth and loyalty. Opinion. Polls conducted in the immediate aftermath of the announcement showed approval ratings for the new king that exceeded anything seen in recent royal history. People were not rejecting a monarch who had revealed his weakness. They were embracing him for his strength in doing so. The day that had begun as a celebration of tradition had become something far more powerful, a demonstration of what the monarchy could be when it chose connection over distance, truth over myth, and humanity over perfection. As the sun set over London on this historic coronation day, it was clear that King William V had not just accepted a crown, he had transformed what it meant to wear one. 6 months after the coronation that changed everything, King William V sat in his private study at Windsor Castle, reviewing the transformation that had swept through the British monarchy. The room was simpler than his predecessors might have preferred. He had removed much of the formal furniture and replaced it with comfortable chairs where real conversations could take place. On his desk sat not just state papers, but also medical reports and letters from ordinary citizens who had been inspired by his openness to share their own health struggles. The immediate aftermath of his announcement had been challenging in ways no one could have predicted. Constitutional lawyers had worked overtime to address questions about succession and regency that had never been seriously considered in modern times. Parliament had quietly begun discussions about what provisions might be needed if the king became unable to perform his duties. But these technical challenges had been overshadowed by something more remarkable: the profound change in how the British people related to their monarchy. The palace mailroom, once dedicated primarily to formal ceremonies and state business, now processed thousands of personal letters each week. People wrote to share their own experiences with serious illness, to offer prayers and support, and simply to express their gratitude for a king who had shown them that vulnerability could be a form of strength. William made it a priority to read as many of these letters as possible, often staying up late into the night to connect with his subjects in this deeply personal way. Catherine had adapted to her role as queen with remarkable grace. though those closest to her could see the toll that constant worry about her husband's health was taking. She had thrown herself into charitable work focused on medical research and support for families dealing with serious illness. Her patronage of organizations that had previously struggled for attention brought new funding and awareness to causes that had been overlooked by more traditional royal interests. The children had shown resilience that amazed their parents and teachers. Prince George, now 15, had matured rapidly as he began to understand that his own preparation for kingship would need to accelerate. He spent more time with his father, learning not just about royal protocol and constitutional law, but about the kind of leadership that values honesty over image and connection over control. Princess Charlotte had become her father's most devoted supporter, often accompanying him on official visits and charming everyone with her combination of royal dignity and genuine warmth. At 13, she seemed to understand intuitively that her family was writing a new chapter in royal history, and she embraced her role in that story with enthusiasm. Young Prince Louis, now 10, remained largely sheltered from the full implications of his father's diagnosis. But even he seemed to sense that their family was special in ways that went beyond crowns and castles. He had begun asking thoughtful questions about what it meant to be brave, and why sometimes the most important thing a person could do was tell the truth even when it was scary. The international response had been equally remarkable. Commonwealth nations that had been moving toward republicanism found themselves reconsidering their relationship with the British Crown. William's honesty had given the monarchy a relevance and authenticity that no amount of traditional ceremony could have achieved. Young people who had previously seen the royal family as an outdated relic began to view them as pioneers in a new kind of leadership based on transparency and human connection. Medical researchers studying William's condition reported unprecedented levels of funding and public interest in their work. The King William effect had brought attention to genetic diseases that had previously been ignored by mainstream medicine. Patient advocacy groups found their voices amplified by royal support, and pharmaceutical companies faced new pressure to develop treatments for rare conditions that affected relatively small populations. But perhaps most significantly, William's announcement had sparked a broader conversation about leadership and authenticity in an age of carefully managed public images. Politicians, business leaders, and public figures around the world found themselves under pressure to demonstrate the same kind of honest communication that the king had modeled. The old paradigm of leadership, based on projecting invincibility and hiding weakness, was being challenged by a new model that valued truth-telling and vulnerability. William's daily routine had evolved to accommodate both his royal duties and his medical needs. He maintained a full schedule of official engagements, but his team had learned to build in more rest time and to be flexible when his energy levels fluctuated. Rather than hiding these accommodations, the palace was remarkably open about them, viewing them as part of the new transparency that defined this reign. The king's doctors were cautiously optimistic about his condition. The stress of the announcement and its aftermath had not worsened his symptoms as they had feared it might. If anything, the outpouring of support seemed to have given him renewed energy and purpose. His medical team had begun collaborating with researchers around the world, sharing anonymized data about his case in hopes of advancing treatment options for other patients. The traditional royal calendar had been modified to reflect William's priorities for his potentially shortened reign. State visits focused on strengthening relationships with nations that shared commitments to medical research and human rights. The annual state opening of Parliament had become an opportunity to highlight legislation that would improve health care, access and support for families dealing with serious illness. The monarchy's financial arrangements had also been scrutinized and reformed. William had insisted on greater transparency about royal expenses and had redirected funds that had previously gone to ceremonial purposes toward medical research and charitable giving. The royal household had become a model of efficiency and accountability that impressed even traditional critics of the monarchy. As William sat in his study that evening, reflecting on the 6 months since his coronation announcement, He felt a deep sense of satisfaction despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. He had kept his promise to himself and to his people. He had told the truth, regardless of the consequences. The relationship between crown and citizen had been fundamentally transformed, built now on honesty rather than mystique. The diagnosis that had initially seemed like a curse had become, in an unexpected way, a gift. It had forced him to examine what really mattered, to prioritize connection over convention, and to use his position to make a real difference in people's lives. Whatever time he had left as king would be measured not in years, but in the depth of impact he could have on his nation and the world. A soft knock on the study door interrupted his thoughts. Catherine entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea and wearing the comfortable clothes that had replaced much of the formal attire that had once defined royal life. She settled into the chair beside his desk, and together they looked out at the grounds of Windsor Castle, where the ancient trees stood as silent witnesses to centuries of royal history. "Any regrets?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. William smiled, reaching for her hand. "Not one," he said. "This is exactly the king I was meant to be." Outside, the evening news was beginning its broadcast with the latest updates on the king's health initiatives and the continuing transformation of the British monarchy. But inside the castle, a husband and wife simply sat together, grateful for another day and committed to making the most of whatever time they had been given. They had learned that the greatest power of the crown was not in its ability to command, but in its capacity to inspire through truth, courage, and love.